Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another episode of Fixing the Forgotten, where we discuss the underpowered, underwhelming, or underperforming units, lords, heroes, and regiments of renown of a given faction, and what could be done to improve them from a multiplayer perspective, to make them more competitive, more appealing, and more viable. And obviously, many of these improvements would also help the factions or these units in single player, but that is not necessarily the main focus here. The main focus here is definitely the multiplayer side of things. And this time around, we will be discussing the Aesir, the High Elves. And this is a faction that overall I would say is in a pretty well-balanced state. They definitely have, they're not a faction that necessarily has a bunch of overpowered mechanics. At the same time, not really suffering from a bunch of underpowered mechanics either. And that said, there are definitely a few little tweaks, I think. In general, many of these recommendations will be more cost-oriented, because I think with the High Elf roster, well, a lot of problems, or one of the big problems for their units is often simply cost. That a unit will usually be just a tiny bit too pricey, and it makes it unappealing, or sometimes not necessarily a tiny bit, but a good bit too pricey. But there are definitely also some glaring outliers that are just not very good, and we will be touching on those as well. Now, first and foremost, for the Aesir, for the High Elves here, is Tyrion. And Tyrion, I know many of you guys were fond of him, but quite frankly, I think from a competitive standpoint, Tyrion's not up there. Maybe on a different faction's roster, he would be more appealing. But within the High Elf one, he really isn't. Now, granted, Alariel, for example, might be a little overtuned, but even if Star of Avalorn gets nerfed, she's still going to be a very competitive pick. Same thing with Tekla, same thing with the Princess. But Tyrion, on paper, Tyrion looks amazing. He's got 125 armor. He's got, his HP actually isn't terrible. Granted, it's like elf tier, but still, it's not terrible HP pool. He does have the Heart of Avalorn, which grants him a massive heal, a massive guaranteed heal when he drops below 20% health. He's got insane mobility, 125 armor, the best combat stats in the game. I think without martial prowess, he might get beaten out by Archaon, but basically, he's better than the vast majority of characters in the game, melee stat-wise, and with martial prowess, I do believe he is literally the best. So that's pretty nuts. He's got crazy mobility with 125 armor, so like this guy's a light cav type unit essentially with 125 armor, 470 damage. Most of that is AP. Charge bonus of 90 is nuts. He also has some nice little peripherals like high fire resist, and he can make those that his own survivability even more insane with Feint and Riposte. He does have Foe Seeker. He's got Stand Your Ground, which gives a little bit of utility, and Sunfang, which can really clear out chaff. So what's his problem? Well, I think Tyrion suffers a lot from what I would call Green Knight syndrome, where his performance on paper looks stellar, but in practice, it often doesn't work out that way. And the reason really is the fact that he's very easy to block up. He doesn't have great mass on Malhandir. He's pretty easy to just block with a unit of trash, unit of chaff. And yes, he can roast that unit with Sunfang. But ultimately, say you roast one unit of Skaven Slaves, your opponent is probably going to have another unit of Skaven Slaves ready to go, and they are going to block you up. Tyrion essentially only really shines if he's killing other big monsters or enemy lords. Otherwise, he's basically not being cost effective. Like, even if he's fighting a monstrous infantry unit, a lot of them are just not that expensive. A generic cavalry unit, he doesn't have enough splash. Like, you throw a bunch of Rice Guard at Tyrion, and he's going to take all day to cleave through them. It's not like he does Fear Terror. It's not like he kills them quickly. And Tyrion's not that cheap. So oftentimes when it's a good combat lord, you'll get, he's a budget option. He's cheaper because you obviously need to bring Caster with him. But Tyrion maxed out with full kit like this is a 2,600 gold lord. He's not cheap. Keep in mind, if I bring Karl Franz on a horse, I can actually bring him cheaper than Tyrion by a good bit, by a couple hundred gold. I think you can, for a bit over 2,000 gold, you can get Karl with full kit on a horse. He's not quite up to snuff as to Tyrion in straight up combat, but Karl Franz has way better utility. He's got the Reichland Runefang, he's got Hold the Line, he's got and then of course he's got Galmaraz to buff himself up. He's got Stand Your Ground for the melee defense buff. He's got an insane lineup of AoEs. Tyrion just has Stand Your Ground and the kind of utility on Sunfang. Ultimately, it's very difficult to justify Tyrion because getting him on the correct target is very tough. Generally, if you want to be trying to snipe out enemy lords or monsters, you're better off bringing a princess or a prince on a... The princess has his own issues, and we'll discuss those in a second, but on a Star Dragon, or just a dragon in general, because they're much more mobile. They can actually pick their fights much more effectively. They've got a higher overall HP pool. Generally, as High Elves, you are going to be bringing a healer of some sort anyway. So the fact that you don't necessarily have the Heart of Avalorn is not the biggest killer. And they've got Breath Attacks, which has a significantly lower cooldown than Sunfang, and doesn't have the requirement to be in melee to recharge. Which, granted, Tyrion's usually going to be in melee, but for 120 seconds in a game, that means you're probably not getting off more than, say, like 1 or 2, or you're probably not getting like more than 2 casts off in a game. And it definitely can happen. You can end up with your second or third cast, if you do get it, going down at a point at which it's irrelevant, essentially. At which point the match is already won or lost. So what can be done to make Tyrion more appealing? Personally, I think the biggest improvement would just be a straight up price cut. Like, if Tyrion was 200 cheaper, he would be a little more, I think, attractive. Because right now, it's very difficult to justify taking, say, Tyrion and a caster instead of taking, say, Teclis and a noble. Keep in mind, you can essentially get Teclis and 2 nobles for the price of, like, Tyrion and a caster. Or maxed out Tyrion and a caster. Which, ultimately, those 2 nobles are probably going to net you more value on horseback. They've got more flexibility. They've got a bit more coverage. Yes, they're nowhere... Like, a single noble is nowhere near the power level of Tyrion, but 2 are very easily there. And Teclis has great utility. He doesn't lock you into a specific lore. He's got a good variety of spells. Or you can bring Alariel for the insane heals. And honestly, it's not going to be much more expensive than Tyrion with a caster. Because ultimately, you got to bring that caster on a horse for safety reasons. You've got to bring that caster is going to have a few spells probably. You're probably not just bringing 1 spell. The Hiles don't really have a 1 lore spellcaster off the top of my head, because you don't have like Lore of Death to spam Spirit Leech, or Lore of Fire to just spam Fireballs. So ultimately, Tyrion falls flat then. I think really the biggest problem here is just his cost. He's just too expensive to warrant. Like, he costs the same as a prince, essentially. When you max out Tyrion, he's the same as a stripped down prince, and ultimately on a Star Dragon. And ultimately, that Star Dragon is generally going to net you much value. It's much more effective against blobs, while being good enough against infantry. And if you're really concerned about... And ultimately has a lot more mobility too, because you've got high mass to get in and out of trouble. You've got flight, which is ultimately more important than just the straight up speed that Tyrion has. Like, Tyrion can catch Skirmish Cav, I guess, potentially, but you're not really bringing him to catch Skirmish Cav. If Tyrion spends his entire game chasing Legion Reavers or Wolf Riders or Marauder Horsemen, you're doing it wrong. So... yeah, it's just very difficult to justify him at his current price point. I think 100 or 200 gold off would be a good way to go. Another option, I think, would be to drop Sunfang's cooldown by 30 seconds. I do think 60 would be a bit oppressive, since Tyrion does not have a difficult time staying in combat. But at the same time, 120 seconds is really obnoxious. It means you often don't get that second cast, much less a third cast, until the match is long over. And even 30 seconds, they can make a huge difference. And I think those would really be the main fixes. I've also seen some fixes recommended to make it so Heart of Avalorn procs at like 30% health. Just because sometimes Tyrion will rout before Heart of Avalorn procs. This used to be a huge issue when it only procced 10%. Now it's less of an issue when it's 20%. Some people still think it's bad. I think it's okay, but maybe that could also be a slight fix. Obviously, the key for Tyrion is that he's supposed to be the fighty, gooning, lord sniping type lord. And that's fine. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, especially some of the casters get a bit tuned down, like Alariel. But I do think that at his current price point, he's never going to be a competitive choice in that sense. Because a dragon is just almost always going to be superior. Which does bring us on to the prince. And the prince is, in fact, I would say, a similar case to Tyrion. Except in his case, it's compared to the princess. So the two have essentially, and keep in mind here, she's popped Dragonborn because the AI is stupid and like immediately pops it. But the prince has essentially the same stats as the princess when he's mounted on a Star Dragon. And keep in mind, when you bring a princess or a prince, you're probably bringing them on a Star Dragon. Because the budget lord choice for the High Elves is Teclis, let's be honest here. If you're going budget, you're probably bringing Alariel on foot or you're bringing Teclis. Maybe Alith Anar. You're not going to bring a prince or princess on a horse. You don't have, say, neither unit has, say, the crowd control of like Prayer of Anathema. Or the buffs and debuffs that, say, the Wood Elf or Dark Elf lords have. So you're probably going to bring him on a Star Dragon. And in that situation, the prince is just generally inferior. His stats are... melee attack and defense is better by 4. But ultimately, for a unit that's cycle charging, diving in and out, and really cherry picking its engagements pretty effectively, that's not as important as that free ranged attack essentially on the princess. The princess gets a ranged attack, unlike the prince, which is honestly a better improvement. The prince, to get real edge in melee, has to invest pretty heavily. You've got to bring his items, and he's got some good items. Blade of Belkor Hadris, great item. Deadly Onslaught, very solid. Foe Seeker, of course, good for that mobility. Bane Shield is not a terrible item, gives you some AoE utility. Stand Your Ground, once again, some AoE utility. In comparison to the princess, definitely doesn't have necessarily the best items. She does have the Flight of High Arrows. She's got Loose, which is an AoE reload buff. But she also does have, say, the Dragon. If she wants to buff herself in melee, she also does have the Talisman of Loek, which is a one-time 26 melee attack boost. She's got the Dragon Horn, which boosts her weapon damage by a little bit, and her missile damage by a bit. She's got Foe Seeker as well. So, ultimately, to make the prince more competitive in melee, you have to bring his items. And he becomes significantly more expensive at that point than the princess. And that's really the only way he becomes a really tangible improvement over her. So I think the best way to fix, quote-unquote, the prince, because he's not a terrible... I think if the princess didn't exist, the prince would actually be a really competitive lord choice, but because she does, you need to distinguish him somehow. I think, one, Bane Shield could be reworked. Maybe reduce the cooldown, increase the cooldown and make it a multiple cast item, or reduce the duration and make it a multiple cast item. Because 30 armor and 24 missile parry is very situational, and oftentimes you might cast it and you just don't get the maximum value you were hoping for, or the good value you were hoping for. And when it's only a one-time cast, it's definitely a bit of a difficult situation to justify. The rest of his items, I think, are decent. The only other recommendation I'd really have for the prince is cut his cost a little bit. Make him a little cheaper than the princess, so bring those items isn't as crippling, because right now, to have a truly superior prince to the princess, you'll end up paying, or at least to make the prince competitive with the princess, in effect, where he's got a significant enough melee advantage to justify the loss of the bow, you have to pay like a good 200, 300 more gold than the princess. And that, on a roster that's generally trying to scrape together money, that is very difficult. And so I think, 100 gold, the off on the prince could be decent. Just cut it off his baseline cost. Could also make him a little more viable as the budget option. As a budget support lord on a horse. More in, like, say, a Boris Todbringer way. Then the princess. I actually don't have too many issues with the princess. My only real take here on the princess is that I hate these skills in general. The reload skill buffs that only work in an area. Ignoring the fact that the princess will generally not be moving. Generally not be standing still because she's on a dragon. These short-ranged AoE reload skill buffs suck in this game. They're god-awful. They don't even work that well in campaign, because let's be honest, in campaign, you're generally not fighting. You're not going to blob everything up into like a tiny 2x4 area. And if you're fighting in multiplayer, this is literally tempting suicide. Because your opponent is... If you blob up your shooting, your opponent is going to run you the hell over. It's not even really you're just going to get run over. He's going to knock out all like 3, 4, whatever. How many archers you brought? They're all going to get tied down by like a single unit of hounds because you've blobbed them up because you're trying to get benefits from this reload skill. So it's a useless skill, essentially. A skill you're almost never going to bring. And personally, I would like to see it reworked, but I think at least increasing the range to 55 meters so you can get some safe spread would be decent. I would extend this also to the Handmaiden's ability, and I actually forgot to put the Handmaiden here, but I would extend this buff to the Handmaiden. I think that would make her a little more appealing, a little more competitive. The Handmaiden's actually not bad. Neither is the Princess. Both are pretty competitive hero choice and lord choice. But I think that the reload skill buffs are just trash. Otherwise, make it a targetable skill. Make it something you can point and click at a specific unit, so you get more benefits out of said unit. But these short range AoEs are just garbage, and that's true facts there. They just don't really warrant bringing them. And so either make it a point and click that's like plus 20 reload on a single unit for like 30 seconds, or make it a map wide effect that lasts like, or make it say like 100 meter radius that lasts for say 20 seconds. And you cast it's like lose. Okay, or the authorization. You even have it here. There's like a description of just lose. So it could just be that the order is given, and then at the end of it, the order is given to hold fire or whatever. Or either way, you can make up some shoddy justification. the point is that in this current form, loose is not competitive. And when we move on to Alith Anar, who's the last lord to be discussed here, the case is essentially the same. Alith Anar himself is not terrible. He's gone from being a pretty trash lord to being a situationally good one. He can snipe enemy artillery, he can chip away at monsters. The biggest problem with Alith Anar is there's two big problems with him. One, his bow is still not particularly accurate. I think the projectile velocity is just too low. He's very easy to dodge and often will miss just because of some wonky animation from your opponent's moving unit. Makes him a bit unreliable at sniping away models. He also doesn't pierce that well, so his actual ability to slaughter, say, cavalry doesn't seem to be that good. So that's one thing, and I think that could be improved by simply improving his projectile velocity a little bit and giving him a little bit more pierce. That's a pretty simple buff. But this other problem that I have with Alith Anar is that he has a lot of crappy abilities and items. We've got Darken the Skies. I'm not going to repeat myself on this one. This is literally the same thing as the Princess buff, just 20 reload skill and stuff. 10, still not worth it because you have to blob up your archers to get any value. Shadow Crown. Now, this isn't a bad item necessarily, but it's very expensive. You get +5 melee defense. The 18% speed essentially doesn't matter because if your opponent is getting within range of you, so to really get value out of this, if you're going for a skirmish build, you're not going to blob up at all. So to really get value out of this buff, you need to be playing a more campy defensive build. And in that situation, the speed buff is essentially irrelevant. And you only get the +5 melee defense, and paying like 200 or whatever gold for a +5 melee defense is just not worth it. It's like a crappy hold the line, and you're paying armor and the like for it. Stone of Midnight, 22% missile resist in a 55-meter AoE seems decent enough, except as the High Elves, you're generally the one dominating the shooting game. The only factions that really can contest you there are like Wood Elves. Sure, it can help a little bit, it's like Empire Artillery, but ultimately, are you really going to bring Alith Anar and have him camp near your troops to get some missile resist? So that's a bit of a problem. Finally, the clone, which is incredibly easy to recognize. Unfortunately, I can't cast the clone. I was going to say I could cast the clone, but I don't have control of Alith Anar here. But the clone is easy to recognize. It's not tricking anybody. It does no damage. And yes, it gives Alith Anar stock, snipe, unspottable, but it just doesn't really deliver. The only good item he's got is the Moonbow, in my opinion. And I guess Slippery's okay. So what could be done to improve this? Well, Loose, like I mentioned, Darken the Skies could have more AoE, could be a targeted ability, could be a map-wide ability in case of Alith Anar, but it would be cool. The sister, or the princess, could have a bigger range. Alith Anar could have a map-wide and a bigger buff to rate of fire that he procs for a temporary amount of time. Would be much more thematic, would be much cooler in my opinion. Shadow Crown, in my opinion, it's just not enough. Either it needs to be cheaper, or alternatively, I could see it being given, like, say, a mass buff, like the old line. High Elves have a big problem with enemies just plowing through the backline. So if you decide to play against Bretonnia and you just want to bring Alith Anar, you could, and let's say you got a buff to Pierce, that would make it more viable against Bretonian heavy cap spam. So then the fact that he gives more mass could make your backline a little more resistant to Bretonian backline breaching. And similar thing against like Empire heavy cav jumping in, a bunch of factions which abuse heavy cav against you. Being able to improve the mass of your troops, especially your cheap spears, would be a big buff in that situation. Finally, Stone of Midnight. Honestly, 22% missile just doesn't really matter. I think it would be cool if it did something like the Trixie Traps for Skarsnik, where it makes your troops cloaked and unspottable for a short amount of time. Maybe the passive could be that 22% missile resist, but unless we're going to make it a bunch cheaper, I think the way to go would be make it an AoE stealth. It would be cool. There could be some great synergies there. You could like synergize it with, say, Swordmasters. Swordmasters normally are incredibly flimsy, incredibly squishy, and difficult to get into combat. This could make it much more viable strategy. You could stealth a pocket of cavalry or shooting if you're advancing into artillery fire, whatever. It would make it a much more, and it wouldn't have to be a long duration, but at least some duration so you can mitigate the enemy range damage. And it would be cool to see. Makes Stone of Midnight a little more useful that way. Slippery is fine. Mislead is a little bit of a tough one. It's kind of just how to make it more viable is a little bit more difficult. I think removing there's a timer that you can see if you scroll over the casted Alith Anar. I think that would be one good step to make it a little tougher to spot which one is the real Alith Anar. Otherwise, giving Alith Anar a baseline stock could help here. because then it would actually be a bit difficult sometimes to tell which is the clone and which is Alith Anar. Because right now you see the real Alith Anar initially, you're not bamboozled by that, and then the moment he casts the thing and Alith Anar disappears, you know where Alith Anar is. Nobody's fooled. Everybody knows that this isn't the real Alith Anar, even if they don't check the unit card to see that it's a summon. So those are two things I'd really fix on Alith Anar. Summon. Those are my takes there. I do think Alith Anar is not terrible when he's stripped down as a cheap lord, but I think that there are a few little things like that he could tweak, and his items could use major overall. We'll just move us on to heroes, and here there's only one real critique I have. The nobles actually here just for comparison. But the Loremaster of Hoeth, and he's not a bad character. He's simply, well, on paper he's not bad. He's got great selection of spells. He's got some cool AoEs. He's got the Blessed Tome, which grants 8 leadership and AoE, which is pretty nuts. 8 leadership is actually solid. Loremaster's Cloak, which is great, 22% magic resist. Foe Seeker, he's got Evasion, which boosts his speed as well as his melee defense by even more. So on paper, this guy's good. The problem is that he's a foot-only hero who's specialized against infantry. The only match where he really shines is against dwarves, but keep in mind, he still costs quite a bit. And while his spell selection is very good, I would say 5 out of 6 of his spells here, except Shem's Burning Gaze. Everything here is competitive, if not great. He doesn't have any Winds of Magic region item. Bring him as a double caster with Teclis or Alariel gets very expensive and is super situational. And well, that's really the gist of it. And then some of his items are a little bit iffy. Like, yes, while 8 leadership is amazing, it's on a faction that already has top-tier leadership. High Elves have one of, if not the best leadership values in the game. Getting more leadership on top of that is kind of pointless. The 22% magic resist on Loremaster's Cloak, while very potent, has limited usage. It essentially only really promotes blobbing. And so the only time I've really seen the Loremaster outside of the Dwarf matchup has been against Bretonnia in a Phoenix Guard noob box. So, what can be done to improve him? First and foremost, I do think giving him the lore passives for Lore of Beasts and Death would be nice. It would give him some sort of Winds of Magic recovery. He's got a lot of relatively cheap spammable spells, so that would synergize nicely, give him some opportunity to regain Winds of Magic there, and you would still have to pay for it. One of the things I really don't want to see done with the Loremaster is strip him down and make him cheaper. Because right now he only costs 800 stripped down, which is decent. You make him cheap, you make him like a 700 lord choice or hero choice, you might be looking at this guy being abusable in, say, the dwarf matchup. And I don't want this to be an abusable hero that you just, in specific matchups, sees just an absolute pain in the rear to break. Your opponent brings him with, like, just stripped down as a melee hero, essentially. I think he should ultimately be a hybrid, and it should be emphasized there. So, the lore of passives to give him some Winds of Magic region I think would improve his situation, because he already has access to some spells that High Elves don't normally have access to, and he's got a nice mix. So just being able to get more Winds of Magic would be nice. Another thing, as I've been discussing with these AoEs, one of the big problems with short-range AoEs on lords that don't have mobility, like Alith Anar, like the Loremaster here, is the fact that you can't position these correctly without blobbing. So essentially, this promotes a noob blobbing play. So my take here would be that make Loremaster's Cloak a short, have a cast range, and be, say, a 30-meter effect that gives, I don't know, 33%, 44%, something like that magic resist, rather than being an AoE around the Loremaster. Might not seem thematic, but I think it would make you much more competitive. It would give you much more versatility and opportunity to use this spell in different ways. You want to support some Dragon Princes, or say you've got Fireborn. You want to support them and prevent them from getting sniped out by Spirit Leech? Boom. You can drop it on them. You want to help them resist, say, a Deliverance of Itza from nuking them? Boom, you can point and click and stop some of the damage. Right now, the fact that it has to be centered on the Loremaster of Hoeth is incredibly crippling and essentially limits it to Phoenix Guard block boxes against Bretonnia. It's really kind of dumb. Blessed Tome, the +8 leadership for the High Elves is just not that good, but honestly, the item, it's relatively cheap. I'm okay with it. I don't think it's too much of a problem, but those are really my 2 cents there. I just don't want him to be dropped in cost anymore, because I fear that would make him abusable. Which does move us out of the hero section and into infantry. And there's only one unit here, and you guys might be shocked by this because the artifact unit I put up, actually there's 2 units, but, well, only one generic unit. And you guys might be surprised by these guys, because I believe I put them in S tier for the tier list. But High Elf Spears for their cost are actually not all that good. As a point of reference here, keep in mind we do have the Call of the Woods, because I brought in a Glade Lord for just because I wanted to do some comparisons with Wood Elf units at a later point. So keep in mind, these guys normally with martial prowess, and right now their leadership is also being buffed by lords and flank secured, blah blah blah. So this isn't quite an accurate description. But with martial prowess, you get 50 melee defense, you get 22 melee attack. Compare this to Empire Spears, chevroned up to cost the same. Keep in mind here they are being buffed by the Dragon Order, which is dumb. But these guys have 51 melee defense, 23 melee attack. So they've actually got better stats than High Elf Spears permanently, not for 50% of their HP. They've got more HP overall. The only thing they've got is a little bit less leadership, a little bit less speed, which is basically irrelevant on a unit like this, and a little bit less armor and some less shield value. But so yes, they do have some disadvantages, but keep in mind chevrons are also supposed to be cost ineffective. And having 51 melee defense for the entirety of your lifetime rather than just half of it is a huge gap. And chevrons are inefficient, generally cost ineffective. So, which is unfortunate. That's not something I'm fond of, but hey, that's a whole nother story. The spearmen, in my opinion, are just a bit overpriced. When their martial prowess drops, and this can happen relatively quickly, you get hit by a wind blast or something, boom, you're down to 38 melee defense. And that's suddenly the same as generic Empire, or I actually think that's less than Empire Spearmen, off the top of my head. That's a pretty significant debuff. So my personal take here is that I think the High Elf Spears could use with a small price cut, probably 25 or so, maybe 50, but I think that's probably pushing it. I would say 25 gold cut. Make them a little more competitive. Nothing crazy, but something to give High Elves a slightly more affordable front line that can hold well. Right now they're a mandatory pick, but it's just because they're the cheapest option you have, and I still do think they underperform for their price. And I just think like 25 gold off would be the right move here. Like oftentimes you bring like 4 or 5 spearmen, so it would add up to like 100, 125 gold savings if you're bringing a if you've got that 25 price cut. And hey, that can make a difference. That can make a big difference. Next up, we do have the Pure Main Company. These guys are not a bad. So if we just look at their equipment plus the fact they've gotten tier 9 stats, they look great on paper. You get Guardian, which is a great trait. You get Armor Sundering, which is really strong. The problem is, while this is very strong on paper, in practice, the Pure Main Company, in my opinion, doesn't get value out of these buffs. Essentially, the only reason you bring Pure Main Company, really, let's be honest here, is essentially a budget Swordmaster. They're in between White Lions and Swordmasters. And that's what you bring them for. But you don't bring them for their unique traits, in my opinion. Armor Sundering on an infantry unit is incredibly difficult. Your opponent essentially has to give you a unit that you want armor sundered. It's the same problem like Peak 8 Guard. Your opponent has to essentially play into your hands, give you a unit that you want armor sundered for you to shoot to death. It can work somewhat in, say, like the Bretonnian matchup where you might snare Grails with like Silver Helms, and then your Silver Helms are doing more damage. So there is the occasional usage, but I think by and large the armor sundering just doesn't pay off. Same with Guardian. High Elves have almost no heroes and lords that are going to operate on foot. At most, it might be like a Lariel, but realistically, Lariel's probably going to be camping in like a Phoenix Guard box. Because you're trying to buff the infantry. Lariel herself is tanky enough. So what you're left with is a unit that's essentially paying for abilities it doesn't really use. Now, personally, I would like to see the so my 2 cents here. I don't mind armor sundering. I can see armor sundering staying around because it has a few limited synergies. Guardian, I feel, should be removed and replaced with something else. It could just be make them straight up hit harder, like say give them 40 weapon strength. Even if that's like evenly distributed between AP and non-AP, may just make them a stronger White Lion. Because Guardian essentially just promotes boxing, and it's not a trait that really makes sense on the unit because it just doesn't synergize well with the High Elf roster. So maybe just straight up buff them. That could be a very basic. That That could be a very basic ability. Otherwise, maybe give them like an inspire on attack ability. Like when they're in melee, they inspire nearby troops. Give them like a +5 melee attack buff or something, or a +2 melee or like +2 melee defense, +2 melee attack, something like that, like a small inspiration effect, or like an encouraged R, like Longbeards, something of that nature. I could see being much more useful and generally applicable than Guardian. Because let's be honest, if you throw these guys in with, say, a bunch of white lines, if you've got a front line of white lines are not the tankiest of infantry. They're not the most resilient of infantry. So being able to buff them up with a inspire and melee effect from the Pyramid Company could be cool. I could see that as being effective. And it would be much more useful and much more generally applicable than a Guardian. And I know a lot of you guys were disagreeing with me on the Pyramid Company's place in my tier list, and I can see where many of you guys are coming from, but at the same time, I do think that their abilities are generally just not delivering. And while I can see Armor Sundering just sticking around, I really do think Guardian especially should go and be replaced. Which does bring us on to shooting, and there's quite a bit to discuss here. So first and foremost, archers with light armor, I'm going to make this quick. Cut their cost. Or buff their melee defense more. Right now, I believe they get +2 melee defense and plus 25 armor for 50 gold. In practice, in most cases, they still get crushed by hounds. The only place this really shines is against factions that bring mortar play, where the 40 armor saves you from being one-shotted by mortars. This is not terrible in and of itself. But it's a very narrow niche, and I would like to see these guys given a little more versatility. So minus 25 gold, I think, could make them more of a worthwhile in general sense. Otherwise, plus like another 2 melee defense or something, make them a little more defined as the more defensive archer would be nice, or give them like another +10 armor, some buff like that. Make him a little more, separate them a little more from the generic archers, and that's really all. Or make them closer, but in cost. That's really all there is to say. Then we do have the only other generic unit, or well, not generic, but it's a faction specific unit, is the Shadow Walkers. These guys, in my opinion, are garbage. They've got less damage over time and less damage per volley than Shadow Warriors. They cost 250, or sorry, not, yeah, they cost 250 more gold. In fact, they cost the same as Way Watchers, despite having effectively inverse stats. Their range damage is inferior. They do have poison, which is nifty, but it's not they're not fast enough to stay outrun heavy cav with it. It's not like you've got chameleon skinks or gutter runners with poison who will outrun heavy cav essentially, or make it incredibly tough for heavy cav to catch them with that poison. Their melee stats are better, but their HP is terrible. They've got 1200 less HP than Shadow Warriors, so that's a huge difference. Even with poison being applied in melee and range, it means they're not really any tankier. Their weapon strength and melee stats are of course significantly better, but baseline actually I believe their melee defense is actually lower than Way Watchers, which is kind of sad. Yeah, they get poisoned and all that, but they're not that resilient for how expensive of a unit they are. They're telegraphed a bunch, because you take Nagaroth, you're giving up two of the best high elf lords. Take Nagaroth, and this is the only benefit you get besides a sick color scheme. But Nagaroth is an amazing color scheme, but that's really the only benefit you get, and it's just disappointing. And Shadow Walkers, obviously, straight price cut wouldn't be more viable. Another thing I'll mention is that on top of that, they don't really counter units high elves struggle against. They don't counter, say, squishy. They counter squishy infantry essentially. High elves already have no problem with that. Like all the high elf heavy cav is specialized against that. High elves have chariots for that. High elves have generic archers and Shadow Warriors themselves who can do that job. So Shadow Walkers don't really deliver in that department. And if you need to defend, like sometimes you'll see like Wood Elves synergize, say Glade Riders with Hagbane tips with Way Watchers or something to protect them from enemy catching them, which is cool and all. But in the case of the High Elves, because you've actually got pretty competitive heavy cav, if you want to defend your Shadow Warriors, you're going to bring some Dragon Princes, Silver Helms, or hell, even a Lyrian Reavers, because they're a cheap throwaway that can buy you time. You're not going to be investing in Shadow Walkers for that. Let's be honest here. They just don't deliver. So obviously price cut could be a way to go. Otherwise, give them these 60 models of Shadow Warriors and keep their stats the same, so they can actually deliver superior range performance. With the poison, I actually don't think the unit would be too OP. They could tweak their melee stats a little bit, maybe drop them down which would be fine, but make it so their range performance is at least better, so they're a more consistent range performer. But right now, essentially, they're probably about 200 points overpriced in my book, maybe like 150. Yeah, they're like 150 to 200 overpriced. They don't really deliver over Shadow Warriors. My main takes here would be, and they are a unique unit to a faction, so I feel like they should be a little more cost effective there, because you are making sacrifices to gain that, and so either price cut or give them more models, make it so they could actually have a real edge and damage up. Because right now you compare them to Shadow Warriors. Shadow Warriors do 18 and 4. These guys do 22 and 5, I believe, damage, which just isn't that good. Give them 60 models and they will be superior to Shadow Warriors, but they still won't have the AP staying power of, say, Weight Watchers, but at least they'll be more of an interim and they will have that poison. So that would be my 2 cents there. Some of you might say, well, boost their HP, so it's on par with Weight Watchers. I actually agree with some suggestions that have been posted by some like Lotus Moon that Weight Watchers should have HP nerfed, so I don't think the Shadow Walkers should get a buff to HP. But definitely do think they should get some buffs to their overall man. Well, if they got more manpower, they would get a buff to HP, but in exchange for loss in melee stats. But that's just my 2 cents there. I just think the unit is not very good. On to Regiments of Renown, we've got the Gray. These guys are just overpriced in my opinion. They've got Snipe, but only 180 range. It's much more difficult to make a unit with Snipe work with only 180 range. It's tough enough with, say, a Waystalker, much less a unit that is a big blobby unit. Yeah, it's also pretty expensive. They cost 1,200. You're paying almost 50% more than you would for a normal Shadow Warrior. They do have the Slowic Shroud, so if you're really good at micro, you can take advantage of Snipe plus Slowic Shroud, and this can make them a very good, say, artillery sniping tool. That said, I feel like that's a very limited niche, and honestly, I feel like the unit is at least 100 gold overpriced. They cost more than Weight Watchers. They don't have AP. They don't have much stopping power. They don't really have any more stopping power than normal Shadow Warriors. They just have Snipe. So I think either buffing their range a little bit so that they can get more use out of Snipes, they give them 200 range. That could be one step. Otherwise, make it so that they're cheaper. Drop their price down to like 1,100. That would immediately make them a little more appealing, if not amazingly appealing. Or 1,050, I think. Like the unit is not that good, really. Generally, you're better off bringing Shadow Warriors. It's just for the niche of artillery sniping, they can be okay. But for that such a niche purpose, I feel like the unit should not cost that much. Next up, we do have the Everqueen's Court, and they're, I guess, another thing that can be okay is Archer duels with, like, say, Wood Elves, but still very niche. I think the cost should be down. Finally, Everqueen's Court Guard. These guys, Regiment of Renown, Sister of Avalorn, basically the same problem as Shadow Warriors. They've only got one real perk, and that's the Banner of Avalorn. Grants more Winds of Magic, which is nice, but they cost 300 more than generic Sisters. It's a roster that's already very cash strapped. Paying more for them. Generally, you don't want to pay 300 more for Sisters of Avalorn if you can help it. You'd rather get another unit of them on the field or getting another unit of Spears to Zone or Illyrian Reavers or whatever. Normal Sisters have good enough melee stats to hold their own. You don't really need these extra melee stats. And I think like 100 gold off these guys is honestly the way to go. Because Banner of Avalon is not bad. The buff to melee stats and rate of fire is definitely good, but it's just not good enough to justify 300 more gold. That's just my 2 cents there. Bolt Thrower. Now this one's interesting. I think its performance so I think it's often brought because it's very strong against artillery or very competitive against artillery. But I think in a general sense, the unit is not efficient. It's good against artillery, and that's about it. But you pay 700 gold for a unit that's good against artillery. It's almost as much as a cannon, and you do not have the versatility. A cannon can still, like an Empire cannon, still has about I believe last time I tested this was about 50-50 chance to win with an Eagle Claw Bolt Thrower. Empire will usually bring Hammer of Witches, which will straight up demolish your Bolt Thrower. Dwarf cannons beat the Bolt Thrower, so you need to bring more of them if you're fighting dwarves. Sure, it's good against Skaven, but nowadays Skaven have Giselles, so you can't counter Warplane cannons as reliably because you might just see Giselles instead. They don't do that much damage to big targets because ultimately their damage per shot is only 200-ish, which is less than half of what a cannon does. And yes, they do fire faster, but ultimately that's generally not enough. They can't pierce. They don't kill cavalry quickly. They only kill like one model a shot usually. And their performance against infantry is pretty miserable. So really, my main suggestion here would just be to buff multi-shot, make it a little more competitive. So if we look at multi-shot's profile here, missile damage is overall 162, but key here is the bonus versus infantry. I would like to see it get another +4 or so bonus versus infantry. Make it a real infantry killer. Something that, because right now single shot is more effective at infantry at anything past like half range, which is rough. I think if the multi-shot had more, I think if the multi-shot did more to infantry, that would be much nicer. It would make the unit a bit less frustrating pick, because right now if you bring a bolt thrower and your opponent didn't bring artillery, you basically feel like you just screwed yourself over. You just blew 700 gold on a unit that's not going to deliver that much. And that's really it. That's really all I have to say about it. It's just that the unit is not that cost effective. So I think giving a more versatility with a bigger bonus versus infantry would be the way to go. And the other thing, and this would actually probably be the compensating factor, drop its leadership. There's literally no reason in my book for why a bolt thrower crew should have higher leadership than infantry, higher infantry than dwarven artillery crews by a significant margin. I believe they have like 10 more leadership than dwarf artillery, which is ludicrous. Like seriously, scale these guys back. I don't know. Eagle Claw bolt thrower crews are practically unbreakable, and it's ludicrous. Drop that leadership value, make them more competitive against infantry. That's my 2 cents there. Next up, onto war machines. Well, onto mobile war machines, we got Alith Anar Chariot. And these guys just suck. If you want a cheap chariot to run squishy infantry over, you're going to bring a Tyrion. Tyrion can chip away at enemies from long range. It's got good mobility at 84, so it can actually outrun basically all heavy cav. And even kite away slower light cav. It doesn't have great armor, but you don't care about armor on a chariot. You don't care about the melee defense. Yes, this unit has great melee defense. But you don't really care about those factors on a chariot usually, because you're pulling through, and if you're using a chariot properly, you're not getting caught out. Yeah, you got good armor, but once again, if you're usually not, if you're taking shots, it's usually going to be AP, like missile play, like handguns or artillery, or in which case that armor doesn't matter. If you're getting caught by heavy cav, it doesn't matter because you're going to get surrounded and beaten down. And ultimately, these guys don't have AP. Look at this AP ratio, 38 to 16. It's like 30% AP ratio. Compare that to Gore Beasts. So Gore Beasts on paper, obviously this is with their perk here, the Primal Fury, which gives them more charge bonus speed, blah blah blah, all that stuff. Now they've got the thing is, Gore Beast Chariots, they cost the same, and that's why I pulled them out here. They got more HP, which ultimately is usually more relevant. Yes, their stats look a lot worse. They've got way less melee defense, way less melee attack. But their AP is way better. They've got essentially double or over double the AP damage of the Alith Anar Chariot. They've got the same mobility essentially. Most of the other factors here just don't matter on a chariot. And they've actually got fear too, which is also useful. It helps break units a little faster. So yeah, like straight up compared to Razor Gore, the Alith Anar is straight up worse. And the other problem is that you compare it to the Noble Chariot, which costs 100 gold more. And as you guys have probably seen, well, first of all, this guy's AP, which is huge, lets you kill heavily armored infantry. Second of all, as you guys have probably seen on some of my testing, the AP damage heroic chariots tend to kill models, unlike the chariot, normal chariots, which is very beneficial when you're trying to prevent your opponent from healing. So that's a benefit number 2 there. Third of all, they synergize much better with healing because it's only one model, so it heals better. They do have a little less HP, but they compensate for that with missile resist. Plus, they've got items that can give them stalk as well as more missile resist with the Sacred Incense. And ultimately, the Noble's just a lot better than the Alith Anar Chariot from a practical standpoint. And yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. So the Alith Anar Chariot, in my opinion, if it was a bit cheaper. And the other thing is, Dragon Princes are also amazing against squishy infantry. So like the Alith Anar Chariot is in this uncomfortable position of being bested by essentially 3 to 4, even if he includes Silver Helms, 3 to 4 units, and the High Elf roster itself are better in its specific role of murdering light infantry than it is, or good enough, and while being more versatile. And that's another point for the Noble Chariot, by the way. Heroic chariots tend to be more versatile in their function. You can use them against cavalry in a pinch, for example. And they're not even that good in isolation because they don't get AP and they're a super expensive Chariot. So I think 100 gold off on these guys is perfectly reasonable. Would make, I think, for some more competition with the Noble. I do think if the Noble, there are some nerfs that say made to Lariel, which is likely in the future, I think. I think the Noble will be tuned down and also be a little less appealing at that point. But right now, Elith Anar Chariot definitely needs a cost cut, in my opinion. I don't think it should get AP, and the reason being is because I think the White Lion Chariot is going to come in the future, because we have been told there will be more Lord packs, right? So I don't think the Elith Anar Chariot will really should get AP, because at that point it'll be overlapping with the likely White Lion Chariot. But that's just my 2 cents there. Finally, monsters, and there isn't that much to touch on here. Flamespire Phoenix, 2 critiques here. 1, the bombing sucks. You guys have already heard this with the dwarves. You've already heard it with the lizards. I'm not going to bore you with it again. Bombardment abilities like this suck and need to just be made into a properly targetable spell. That's all there's to say. Second of all, Rebirth. I really hate the 50-50 aspect of this mechanic. I would much rather see it proc at 20% HP and grant a guaranteed heal. I extend this to the Help Abomination as well. I think this is a huge RNG factor. It can make it or break games and is incredibly frustrating, both to play with and against. And I just think it's, quite frankly, terrible. I just don't enjoy this mechanic. I think it's a terrible mechanic. And there are a lot of people who share that opinion. I know some people might enjoy the randomness of, does my unit live or die? I do not. I think it's abysmal. But I would personally like to see it made a perfect cast chance. It's guaranteed. And it guarantees to heal you, but for less than it does now. Right now, it essentially gives you full HP back. So make it like a 50% of the heal it does now, but guaranteed. And at lower HP, so you don't have those stupid situations where your unit routes and just routes at full HP. So that's just annoying. Next up, we do have the Frostheart Pigeon. I think this guy's just simply a little too expensive. There isn't much to say for it. At 1650, he's competing. He's already competitive, or well, viable in some matchups. Vampire counts because they've got very low melee attack. Is a prime example, I think. But he can also be decent against the Empire as a backline disruptor because he's kind of tough to get rid of, especially with the Blizzard aura as well as Attuned to Magic. But I do think a slight downward tweak would be nice because right now he's competing with the Sun Dragon for cost. Hate to say it, the Frostheart Phoenix just doesn't really match the Fire Dragon in most cases at all. You don't have the 3 breath attacks. The survivability isn't really that much better. Yeah, you got more mobility. Yeah, you got a few perks here and there, but yeah, I think like dropping like 50 gold, honestly, maybe at most 100 gold on the Frostheart Phoenix would be the way to go. Nothing crazy, nothing to make it overbuffed, but just something to make it a little more viable in comparison to a Sun Dragon, and put it more in an interim spot between Flamespire Phoenix and Sun Dragon. And that's another thing. If you want cheap terror, you're not going to bring this. You're not even going to scrimp for those 50 gold when you can just grab a Flamespire Phoenix. But yeah, that's really my 2 cents there. That is it for this video on the High Elves. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you found it entertaining and perhaps a little thought-provoking. If you have your comments, critique, questions, if you think I'm misjudging some of these units, if you don't agree, or if you have your own suggestions, as usual, post them down below. I'd love to hear them. I really enjoy reading your guys' responses and seeing what people come up with. Some of you guys have seen some of the responses. So really surprised me. It's like ideas I'd never really considered and thought were pretty awesome. And now I really want to see in game, and I'd honestly just love to hear what you guys have to say there. So, hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.